At my grandfather's 80th birthday party, everyone raised their glasses. My husband leaned over to me and said quietly, "We're leaving. Something is very, very wrong here." I was standing at the front of the room when my mother called me over to help with the serving. Grandfather's 80th birthday was an event that had been discussed for months. The table was bursting with food. The relatives were clamoring, everyone trying to look necessary and important. I was carrying plates, filling glasses, smiling. No one noticed that it all rested on me. I was always a quiet background to them. I have a rare name, Liam. To them it's cause for jokes. Aunt Linda talked loudly about how hard it was to take care of Dad. She called herself the only one who really pulls the family together. I listened and counted in my mind how many times in the last month I had been the one to buy medicine and groceries. How many times I had paid the bills because Uncle Paul was having temporary difficulties. They sat and laughed, clapping each other on the shoulder. My help was invisible. It was convenient for everyone. I walked over to my grandfather. He was sitting in his chair, eyes tired, but there was still strength in his voice. He asked how I was doing. I answered briefly, "Working. Everything is stable." He nodded. The others didn't even notice our conversation. For them, Grandpa is a symbol. To me, he's a living person they use just as they use me. When the cake was brought out, my mother raised a toast. She thanked Linda and Paul for taking care of her. Their names sounded like a reward. My name didn't come up. I stared at the candle flames and thought how easy it was to erase me. My husband sat next to me. He held my hand under the table. His fingers were stiff but warm. He saw more than I wanted to show. After the toasts, the conversations grew louder. The family discussed my grandfather's house, who would get what, how everything would be divided. They did it right in front of him as if he were gone. I was silent. My husband leaned over to me and whispered, "We're leaving. Something is very, very wrong here." I pretended not to hear, but his words stuck in my mind. I looked at the faces around the table. My mother pretended to laugh, but her eyes were running. Linda held a folder in her lap, covered by a napkin. Paul was writing something on his phone, looking away all the time. I noticed him forwarding photos of the documents. They were trying to hide it, but not trying too hard. They figured I wouldn't pay attention. In the kitchen, I stopped at the window. Through the glass, I could see Linda and Paul out on the porch. They were arguing. I heard separate words: house, bills, don't tell. My teeth clenched. When I returned, my mother immediately asked why I was late. I replied, "I was washing my hands." She nodded, but her eyes slid sideways to where the folder lay. Then came the pictures. Linda took pictures of the cake, the kids, a general shot. In all of them, I was on the side, on the edge, or cropped out. It was like I wasn't even there. I looked at her phone screen and grinned. Apparently, the role of decoration in this family is fixed for me forever. Grandpa asked for water. I brought a glass. He thanked me quietly, almost in a whisper. No one noticed. But when Linda handed him the spoon, everyone applauded. I realized that in this game, applause is not for actions, but for the loudness of words about one's actions. I didn't play by those rules. The longer I sat there, the clearer it became. The celebration was a cover for something else. The family looked at each other too often, whispered, paused when I passed by. I recorded every little thing. And suddenly I realized that they had long ago decided that I was a guest. Not a family member, but a spectator. When the coffee was brought out, the conversation turned to money. Paul talked loudly about how hard it was to support a family, and that everyone had to contribute their share. He talked as if I had never contributed. My mother chimed in, adding, "Some do more than others. But we're a family." I sipped my coffee and watched their faces. Sarcasm was on my tongue. "I wonder who pays your pharmacy bills?" But I remained silent. In this room, any word I said would be turned into an accusation. My husband had been silent the whole time. His eyes slid from face to face. When Paul started to tell me that the house should stay in the family, and it's dangerous to trust outsiders, he squeezed my hand lightly. The word outsiders was thrown in on purpose. I realized they meant me. I am the granddaughter, but they had found a way to make me an outsider. At some point, my mother brought out an envelope and placed it on the table. Everyone bent over the tablecloth, examining its contents. I saw Paul smiling and Linda calculating something in her mind. My footsteps slowed. I stepped closer, but my mother covered the envelope with the palm of her hand and said, "Emma, go watch the children." I didn't object. Just looked her in the eye. She looked away. The children were laughing in the other room. I stood at the door and listened to their screams. At the same time, I heard the voices of adults behind me. "Let's do it this way. The main thing is that no one interferes. We have to do it quickly." I realized they were talking about documents. And I realized that I was an extra in these conversations. I wasn't invited to the table where they were deciding my grandfather's fate. But all the expenses were on me. I went back, got my cup and sat down next to my husband. He leaned over and said in a low voice, "Do you see what's happening?" I nodded. I didn't need an explanation. I saw it all for myself. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't going to swallow it. The evening continued. Appetizers were put on the table again, glasses were raised, and they talked about the future. I heard every word, but I felt I was behind glass. They lived their lives in which there was no room for me. Just responsibilities. Just the bills and the safety net. Everything else they distributed among themselves. When Linda raised a new toast and said, "We are one family and we decide everything together," I grinned involuntarily. The word "together" sounded like a joke. I knew at that very moment they had done everything they could to exclude me. They weren't even trying to hide it, they figured I'd keep quiet anyway. That had been the case in the past. But not today. The husband leaned in again and said, "We're leaving. Something is very, very wrong here." I looked at the faces at the table, at their fake smiles, their loud words, their demonstrative fraternization, and I realized he was right. I stood up as if I was going to get more tea, but I knew inside that my place here was over. The family was celebrating my grandfather's 80th birthday, and I sat next to him and realized that I was already crossed out. Quietly and definitively, what happened next changed everything. Subscribe and stay, you won't want to miss how it unfolded. As the guests began to disperse, I noticed that the most important conversations were just beginning. The house slowly emptied of laughter and congratulations, but my mother, Linda, and Paul were in no hurry to leave. They sat at the table, leaning toward each other, and whispered over that particular folder. I knew I should go over, but I decided to stay back. Sometimes silence is louder than any question. My husband sat down next to me, quietly asking, "Do you see everything?" I nodded. I didn't need an explanation. These scenes had been repeated for years. Something hidden, something decided, me left on the sidelines. The difference was that before I tried to believe everything was being done right for the good. Now the illusions were over. I was just observing. Linda opened the folder wider. Inside were papers with stamps and my grandfather's signature. I saw familiar numbers. They were bills for his treatment. I remembered transferring the money. My mother used to say, "We'll pay you back later." Paul promised. "It's only temporary, my contract's about to open." Nothing came back. All the money was in my name. And now these documents were in their hands, as if they were their credit. "We've got to speed it up," Linda said. "Dad's getting old, we can't wait. The main thing is to do it in such a way that there are no complications," her mother added. Paul was silent, smiling as he leafed through the papers. I realized they weren't talking about treatment. They were talking about the house. The house where I had spent my childhood, and where I now came only to care for my grandfather. My mother noticed me looking in their direction and quickly closed the folder. "Liam, help in the kitchen," she tossed across the table, said in a tone that suggested no refusal. In the kitchen, I poured water even though no one had asked for it. My husband came in next. "They're using your payments," he said. "And now they want to pretend it's their contribution." I shrugged. It was nothing new. But something shook inside. I'd agreed to keep quiet before. Today, silence felt like complicity. When we returned, the atmosphere was even heavier. They were discussing who would be closer to home. Linda suggested that the house should be assigned to her because she is the only woman among the children and should live near Daddy. Paul objected. "I have a family, I need it more." The mother summarized. "We'll sort it out later, the important thing is to get it all done now." All three of them nodded. I didn't intervene. But every word they said fell like a stone. I heard them call my grandfather not by name but resource. To them, he was no longer a person but an object. A house was a reward. Money was proof of caring. And I was the person who provided all the expenses, but remained behind the scenes. Later, when my grandfather was asleep, I decided to check his room. There, in the drawer of the nightstand, I found another folder. Inside were his notes, receipts, prescriptions, letters. Many of them had my signature on them. He'd folded them separately, neatly, as if he wanted me to see them. At that moment, I realized that Grandpa knew everything. He saw who was really paying. He just kept quiet, just like I had all these years. I went back to the table. They were laughing like nothing had happened. Linda was telling a neighbor a story about how she carries Daddy's medicine every week. Paul chimed in, her mother inserted comments. I listened and thought, if they spent half as much effort on the real thing as they did on the stories, maybe I wouldn't have to pay alone. Liam, pour us some more tea, Mother said. Not a request. A command. I silently got up and did. At that moment, for the first time, I felt sarcasm instead of fatigue. I watched them drink my tea and thank each other for caring. I wondered if I should give them a medal too. When the tea was drunk, the conversation turned to money again. Paul talked loudly about his debts. He mentioned the amounts as if he were preparing a defense in court. I just need time, he said. Everybody knows I'm trying. But business is tough right now. Linda picked up on that. We're all trying. It's just that some help more than others. I noticed the way my mother looked at me. It was like a knife, you have to. I pretended not to notice. I picked up the empty plates and carried them into the kitchen. I was seething inside, but I didn't let anything out. The plates clinked against the sink. My husband came in next. They expect you to agree to keep paying, he said quietly. I grinned. I wonder how many more years they'll call it temporary. As I walked back, I heard my mother explaining. The main thing is not to divide the house into small parts. That's silly. The house has to stay with one person. Linda immediately said, Me. I'm always around. Paul objected. No, I have a family. I need it more. They argued as if I didn't exist. I sat across from them and didn't say a word. I wasn't a candidate. My name wasn't even mentioned. I noticed how my neighbor, who had also stayed for the evening, listened to them with surprise. She cast glances at me as if she expected me to intervene. I didn't. I looked at this scene as a play in which I had long ago been given the role of furniture. Let them play. Let them divide the property while the one they were caring for slept in the other room. Later, my mother came to me again. You do realize it's better if everything stays in our line, she said. Her voice was sweet, but her eyes were cold. I am your daughter, I answered calmly. She was quiet for a moment, then said, You've always been special. Too sensitive. It was her standard trick, turning my candor into weakness. I didn't object. There was no point in wasting energy on it. When I stepped out into the courtyard, the air seemed different. Silence. Only the light from the windows. I could hear their voices through the glass. They were discussing papers. Over and over again they repeated the words, It must be done, in time, so that there are no problems. I stood there and thought, it was an interesting performance. They were deciding my life without me, and they were sure that it was the right thing to do. Sarcasm saved me from anger. The important thing is that I take out the trash on time, I thought. When I returned to the house, my husband was sitting in the corner watching silently. He didn't intervene, but I could see in his face that he had long ago realized what I was just beginning to recognize. There was no surprise in his gaze, only a firm calmness. He looked at me and said quietly, You've already made up your mind. I didn't answer. The answer was obvious. Meanwhile, the argument was getting louder. Paul waved his arms. Linda interrupted him. Her mother tried to reconcile, but she did so selectively, always taking Linda's side. The three of them argued about the future, as if I wasn't sitting in the same room, like my presence was a technical error. I listened and registered every word. They weren't just excluding me, they were rewriting history. My mother was recounting how Linda had spent months caring for my grandfather. Paul was nodding. Linda smiled modestly. And I counted. All the prescriptions, all the receipts, all the bills, my signature was there. I didn't say a word. But inside it was clear. Everything I was seeing today would be impossible to forget. When the argument died down, my mother offered to pour wine. She poured glasses and smiled. "Let's leave the unpleasant topics," she said. "Today is a holiday." I smiled back. But it was not a smile of joy, but of farewell. I knew. The holiday was over. For me it was. This is the climax. Everything you've been waiting for is right here. Subscribe now to see the hero put everyone in their place. I sat in silence as the argument finally descended into a shouting match. Linda and Paul interrupted each other, and my mother intervened every now and then, pretending to settle the conflict. In fact, she was only directing the conversation where she wanted it to go. Their voices merged into one stream. There was no room for my grandfather or me in that stream. I was in the room but virtually absent. My husband looked at me and waited. I knew the moment had come. He had seen me swallow years of humiliation, of paying bills that were written on someone else's merit. He'd been silent the whole time, but it was his gaze that nudged me. I got up and went to the closet where my mother had left the envelope. It was lying in plain sight, as if it already belonged to them. I picked it up and placed it on the table. The papers parted. In the top corner of each was my signature. "What are you doing?" Linda asked. My voice was shaking. "Showing you the facts," I answered calmly. Paul tried to grin. "It's just your petty translations. It's the little things that hold the whole house together," I said. "And you know it." My mother took a step toward me. "Liam, don't do this. You're making this harder than it has to be." "No," I replied. "It's always been simple. You used my money." I didn't say anything. Not today. The room grew quiet. They looked at each other. I saw fear. They were used to my agreement. My silence. Now it was gone. And with it came a breakdown in their routines. "You're ungrateful," my mother spoke first. "We've always tried for you. You've done it for yourself," I said. "And now go on without me." I put the papers back together and closed the envelope. Not to give it back to them, but to take it back. Let them try to continue the argument without the facts. My husband was already holding my coat. I took it and calmly put it on. No one stopped me. As we walked out into the yard, I heard the house talking again. But they were different voices. There was no more confidence. Just confusion. I walked to the car and felt quiet inside for the first time in a long time. Not joy, not anger. Just clarity. That night I realized my role was over. There was no need to yell, to explain, to convince. Just walk away. And never come back. We got into the car, but I didn't start the engine right away. I looked at the house lit from inside. Silhouettes flashed in the windows, my mother explaining something to Linda, Paul waving his arms. They were busy blaming each other. I felt it for the first time. They could no longer use me as a shield. I was out of the game and now they'd have to handle it on their own. "Do you want to go back?" my husband asked. His voice was calm. "No," I answered. There was nothing more to do there. On the way home, I remembered the details of the last few years. How many times my mother had called to borrow some money. How many times Linda had reminded me, "You work, it's easier for you." How many times Paul had said, "You know, I have a family, I can't do this." I agreed. I always agreed. They're used to my yes being forever. Now it's become a no. The phone rang all evening. First my mother. Then Linda. Then Paul. I didn't pick up. The messages came one after another. "You've got it all wrong. We're a family. You can't do this to us." I read those lines and smiled. The black humor is that they really believed in the word family. Only family to them is those who pay and keep quiet. The next day I went to the bank. Stopped all transfers. Closed access to the accounts that were being used through me. The employee asked, "Why?" I said, "Enough." No further explanation was required. In the evening the calls came again. The tone was different. Accusations. "You betrayed us. How could you abandon us at a time like this?" I didn't answer. Every word sounded hollow. I knew. They didn't ask for help, they demanded it as a duty. Now there was no debt. A week later my mother came to my house. Without calling. She stood on the doorstep and talked a lot. About love, about duty, about everyone should help. I listened in silence. Then she said, I've helped enough. And closed the door. She didn't knock again. A few days later I went to my grandfather's house. He was sitting by the window looking out into the garden. When I entered he smiled. On the table was the same folder with my receipts. I've seen everything, he said. Don't think your labor was unnoticed. Those words were the only acknowledgement I'd ever needed. I nodded. We didn't discuss anything else. We just sat next to each other and were silent. That silence was warmer than any words from the family. Later rumors reached me. A neighbor said Linda was complaining to everyone about how the ungrateful daughter had abandoned the family. Paul was confirming her words. The mother was crying in addition. They were creating their version of events where I was the villain. Didn't surprise me. Everyone defends their own story. Let their version live separately. I'm not a part of it anymore. My husband once asked me, "Doesn't it hurt you to hear all this?" I said no. It used to hurt. Now it was empty. And in that emptiness was liberation. Each day their voices grew farther away. The calls became less frequent. First every hour, then once a day, then silence. They tried to get me back in the game, but they realized the field was closed. Without my money, without my consent, their system had cracked. I wasn't happy about it. I was just stating a fact. In the evening, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea. I looked out the window. My grandfather's house was burning with light, but it seemed alien. There were plays going on there, but without me. For the first time in a long time I felt that I was breathing freely. And I realized that sometimes the loudest word is silence. One day I saw them all together again. It was in the store. Mother, Linda and Paul were standing at the checkout counter. They were talking excitedly about something. When they saw me, they were silent for a second. Then the mother came closer. "Liam, let's talk. We can fix this." I looked at her and said, "There's nothing to fix." And I walked away. They never tried to talk to me directly again. Time passed. Grandfather grew weaker. I visited him alone. He thanked me each time with a simple look. No long conversations, no loud words. Just the fact that he saw who was really there. That was enough. A couple weeks later, I was told that Linda was again telling acquaintances how she was pulling the whole household by herself. I heard it and wasn't surprised. Everyone has their own truth. Let them have theirs. I wasn't going to challenge her anymore. It was quiet inside me. There was no anger, no pain. Just silence. I realized I was no longer in their system. I wasn't cut out. I was out. And that's why I had nothing to prove. That night I turned off my phone. I sat on the porch of my house. The air was cool, and for the first time it didn't smell of debt, obligation, or other people's demands. It smelled of freedom. I sat for a long time until it was dark. No calls, no words. Just me and silence. And in that silence I heard the most important thing. I no longer needed to make excuses. The story was over. I closed my eyes and let myself just be. No roles, no responsibilities. Sometimes the most important decision is the silence that no one else can break.